Hey folks, my name is Pravus, and welcome to more Plague Inc. Evolved with our Mega Brutal Guide series. And this time around we have landed on the Neurax worm, a popular favorite, mostly because the Neurax worm is truly unique from all the other diseases and has its own playstyle, but also, let's be honest, it's one of the easiest ones to beat on Mega Brutal because we can sidestep some of the biggest challenges with the islands and the cure. But the Neurax worm is quite fun. It's going to have a different set of genetics to it though. We will stick with the metabolic jump because I really am not worried about getting an extra early boost with ATP. I'd rather have the extra DNA throughout the game. Darwinist is quite useful because there are a few very expensive mutations that can save your run and help make it a 5-star victory. Aquacyte and Extremophile are still completely fine. And then one thing that I've been starting to play with lately, I used to ignore this, was transstasis. Transmission costs will not increase instead of the symptoms. And that's because the Neurax worm is kind of unique in its transmissions, but I'll show you why in just a second. This will be called itching allergy. Okay, sure, that seems completely fine. Let's start in Saudi Arabia, as we often do. So the Neurax worm has a completely unique transmissions, symptoms, and abilities tree. We will be starting on the transmissions instead of symptoms because the Neurax worm is the only disease type that I know of that has severity added onto all of its different transmissions. So you wanted to increase your severity just to get that extra DNA from bubbles, but transmissions are a method of doing that with the Neurax worm. We can actually skip symptoms entirely until we are ready to go for the win. That is why transstasis ends up being a very valid pick, and it's something that I've overlooked until fairly recently, and I have found it actually works pretty darn well. So getting some of those early transmissions for super duper cheap is obviously quite nice. We're going to go for Eggs 1 and Eggs 2. That is going to increase our infectivity by a pretty reasonable amount for a very, very low price. Then we're going to go for Concertina Locomotion for 2 DNA, and then Undulatory Locomotion, all of this being very cheap and resulting in a pretty decent amount of severity and infectivity, and we've only just barely started the game. Once you get the Undulatory Locomotion, this is where you will find your air and water transmission. We're going to start by going for air because we did start in Saudi Arabia. This helps me get into all the other nearby arid countries and take advantage of that airport, so it does make sense. But the good thing about the Neurax worm is it actually has 3 levels of water transmission, which ends up being pretty darn good as you want to get to some of those islands or get around in the humid countries. So we will worry about that in just a little bit. But the top priority is getting out of Saudi Arabia and into my neighbors. To that end, we're actually going to pick up Bird 1 a little bit early here. Normally I would have skipped this, but after doing a fair bit of play testing, it turns out that little bit of extra land transmission does make the whole scenario go by a bit faster. And by the end of this scenario, when I'm ready to get Transcendence, I usually find that I have to circle back and pick some of these up anyway, just to fill in some of the gaps where my transmission has fallen behind. So it actually makes sense to go for Bird a little bit earlier than you usually would. Now, since I have enough DNA, I'm going to go for 2 levels of water. Then we're going to go for water level 3, which will result in a pretty substantial amount of our infectivity. And again, the severity is right on pace with where I really want it to be in order to get a lot of value out of these bubbles as we get around the world. So this has been solid. This is all we really need to get started here with our transmissions. We will circle back in a bit to get things like genetic swap, which will increase my mutation chance, and we will take advantage of mutation, for sure. Mutation can be very useful. In the right cases, it might save you upwards of like 60 DNA toward the end, and that can make or break a 5-star victory. So if we can get it, awesome. If we can't, oh well, it's not a very big deal. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pick up a level of drug resistance so we can speed up our spread in some of the wealthy countries. Then we're going to go for a couple levels of cold resistance. I usually do need at least 1 level of heat resistance as well, but we can come back to that in at least a bit. So let's pick this one up. Once we have cold resistance level 2, we can move on to one of the new features of the Neurax worm, the Trojan Plane, where basically we hijack the brain of one of our victims and say, you want to fly to such and such a place. And that's exactly what they're going to do. This is the power that is going to help us get around all of the islands in this game, right? The islands that normally could cost us everything. However, I'm going to actually go against the grain here. Normally in the past I've said just go ahead and hit every single island. I've actually been doing some testing and I find that's not always totally true. You see, once you get down the symptoms, your goal ultimately is to work toward a transcendence victory. You want everyone to worship you as some sort of a new god. And once they start worshiping you, they do not work on the cure. Therefore, it's actually far more valuable to be infecting wealthy countries more so than a bunch of little islands that don't really contribute much to the cure progress. However, obviously, there's still a fine balance. You want to make sure you get some of the hard-to-reach islands in order to make sure you actually beat the scenario in a timely fashion to get the maximum score. So what I would actually say are top priorities here, you want to think about the nations that are the rich ones and also the hardest to reach. That's going to include places like Sweden. Sweden is usually one of the last countries to get infected if you have a Saudi Arabia start. Morocco often ends up being an issue as well. And then beyond that, you want to think about things like the Caribbean, you want to think about Greenland, you want to think about New Zealand, and you want to think about Iceland. Those are the other 4 that can mess you up. So kind of in that order, I would think about things like Sweden, Morocco, maybe New Zealand, then Iceland, Greenland, and eventually getting into the Caribbean. That will typically be all you need. Everything else should be fine from there. Once we've got that, though, let's go ahead and swap back over to our transmissions. We're going to go for genetic swap and a couple levels of mutative regeneration here, which is going to make me very prone to mutation. And now we can go back over here and pick up drug resistance level 2. Drug resistance level 2 means we're going to start spreading faster in places like Europe and the United States. And of course, like I said, we want to get the wealthy nations on our side so they start worshiping us instead of working on the cure. Now it is finally time to start thinking about our win condition, which is to go down neural breach, cerebral tendrils, frontal mesh, immaturity, mania, and obsession. These were all relatively cheap here to pick up, and it didn't even have symptostasis, which is one of the reasons I just don't think that symptostasis is absolutely required for this scenario. We got a lot more value out of moving fast with our transmissions. There is another path you could go down here with an adrenergic constriction and eventually like psychosis and such, but I find that sometimes it reduces your severity, and I don't really want to reduce my severity. I'd rather keep it nice and high. So this ends up being a better path. We're working toward devotion over here, and then eventually right here, transcendence. Now, transcendence will get very expensive depending on how your spread has been going up to this point and how much the genetic drift is starting to affect you. Let's go to Morocco, just knock that out now before it becomes a problem. So sometimes it costs you something on the order of like 60 DNA to pick this up. Right now, it's already at 48. I mean, that is a lot, right? So you have to think about that. Getting a mutation that picks that up for free is obviously pretty massive, which is one of the reasons I went for the mutation chance. On the off chance, the game is nice to me and just gives it to me for free. Right now, we're only missing the Caribbean, Mexico, and Canada. The Caribbean I'll pick up simply because I do need to get to an island. Canada technically is a wealthy country that I would have liked to infect a lot longer ago, but oh well, we did not get that. I did pick up Adoration as a free mutation. So close. So very close, and yet so far. Let's pick up Transcendence before it gets any more expensive, and now we got to think about what else we would like to do. So taking a look here at our current spread, we could go for another level of air transmission. It's kind of expensive, but it does work in the rich and hot countries as well as arid locations, which is kind of everything I need right now. I need hot countries and arid locations like in Africa, South America, and these islands down here to get infected. I need the rich countries to get infected. It just makes sense. Based on that, though, let's go ahead and take our Trojan plane, move it over here to the Caribbean. One thing to be aware of, by the way, if you select the Trojan plane and then open up the menu to figure out where you want to send it, it will cancel the Trojan plane. So know where you want to go before you click on the button, otherwise you're going to feel very, very bad. Now you might think that Trojan planes are useless at this point. They are not. If we were to go down a couple levels of Trojan plane, we would actually be able to increase the infectivity in a specific country by a pretty wide margin. So that is one option. If you're sitting on a lot of DNA, you can go down Trojan planes level 2 and down over here, that's something useful. Alternatively, you can start thinking about like, maybe I want to go for, let's say, some extra rodents as transmission to spread faster in urban Europe. That wouldn't be bad. We can also pick up some insects since transstasis is active. All of this remains relatively cheap for us, and it does get us some extra, I think it usually gets you some extra mutation. It actually doesn't say that down here, so maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I shouldn't assume that this increases mutation. It does for literally every other disease type, but that might not be the case over here. Let's go ahead and pick up Trojan planes 2, and then we'll go for Trojan roamers, increasing infectivity in a target country. Canada is a little bit behind the curve right now, so I'll go ahead and send this over here just to get a pretty substantial boost. We'll see what happens here. That'll boost up to a few thousand extra people just suddenly started worshiping the worm. That's great. But it's going to increase the transmission here a little bit, so that's going to go a lot faster. And then we can just focus on spending our DNA on getting some genetic reshuffles and just try to eke out a tiny bit of extra score. But for the most part, it's really going to come down to Iceland, Greenland, and West Africa. Canada actually already has been fully infected, showing you just how impactful those Trojan planes really can be now. One problem is, because the entire world has been infected and we haven't really killed people, the genetic drift remains in full effect for a while. So things like genetic reshuffle level 2 remains quite expensive for a bit. And that does kind of suck, but I mean, you really don't have a good way around it. But good news is, notice no one's even working on the cure anymore. They simply do not care. They are quite happy worshipping the worm. I'm going to spend whatever DNA I can at this point to just go ahead and make our disease a little bit more complex. Anything that boosts up some of my final stats, like my severity and stuff, would be nice. We'll wait until the very, very end of the game. We got something for free. Well, that's great. We're just waiting on what? Iceland? Iceland is done. So what can I afford for 25 points? Really not much, so I'm just going to go ahead and grab a couple levels of Corpse Feeder because I know that that's worth a lot of severity, just trying to get a little score, and that should be it. Everyone has been infected. There is a giant worm that is latched onto their brain and affecting their thoughts and emotions. They are worshipping us as a new god and master. As a result, we get a 4-star victory at 80,000 points, almost within 1 year. This is actually probably the best run I've had with this for a while. So yeah, the Neurax worm is stupidly easy. It's really not much of a challenge at all. The fact that we don't even have to worry about the islands, there's no stress. I'm not waiting to find out if Russia is going to get infected enough. I know I can get there. Really, I just need to prioritize getting into all those different wealthy countries, whichever ones are the hardest to get into, and that will be your friend. Other than that, though, yeah, not hard at all. And if you happen to get a mutation that gives you Transcendence for free, so much the better. That's the fastest way to actually win this scenario. So we like the Neurax worm. We love the worm. The worm is great. Praise the worm. But not exactly a challenge with this strategy. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it informative and helpful in some way. If you did, I would ask that you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, make sure you hit that notify bell, and I will see you guys next time.